Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about the king of the instruments, the lion, the roaring lion of the musical world. That instrument that is the most versatile, the most emotive, and yet the most physically cumbersome. The great contradiction that is the organ. Now, there are many different types of organs, and when it comes to pipe organs, no two are exactly alike. And there's not that many of them in the world. There's fewer than 200,000 left. And while that might seem like a lot, just think that there are around about 800 million guitars, which isn't necessarily surprising because a guitar can be made by hand if you're a good enough craftsman, where to make an organ is a labor of love, to say the least, but it is very laborious. It's very difficult, and it's a skill that in many ways is fading away, although there are still great organ makers making these wonderful instruments. Now, the organ isn't just one of the most complex instruments, but again, paradoxically, it's one of the oldest. It traces its roots to ancient Greece, a great center of culture in the ancient world, but it really became ever more prominent in medieval and later Renaissance Europe, where it became the de facto instrument of choice in the Roman Catholic Church. By contrast, in the Orthodox Church, there was and still is, a strict prohibition on instrumental music. The music you would hear in the Orthodox Church, both then and now, is chanted, it is vocal. Whereas in Western churches, which was only the Roman Catholic and later others, Lutheran, Anglican, etc., then further down the line, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, etc., you'd have organ as the de facto instrument of choice. And it was from there that people decided to take the organ out of church. In addition to having it in church, it became an instrument over the centuries that became something that you had to have in your grand civic centers, your great city and town halls, later on in your department stores, and just about anywhere else that would have a requirement for a large instrument to fill a large space and do so only with one musician. And the economic rationale for that is that while the organ itself is incredibly expensive, over time it would pay off to hire one musician rather than an ensemble or even an orchestra to fill a large space. Now, the first truly great composer for the organ was none other than Johann Sebastian Bach, and I would contend that some of his greatest pieces are those composed for the organ, and they really, to this day, still sound best played on the organ. And although Bach was a musician, frankly, centuries before his time, he was quite forgotten not too long after his death. But luckily, the organ was going to get bigger than ever in the centuries following his death, because while he died in the 1750s, it was in the 19th century that the organ really began to grow to gargantuan and frankly beautiful heights. And this was a golden age of organ for frankly all of Europe, but France in particular. The French always loved the organ, and they produced some of the greatest organists and composers, and frankly, probably more than any other instrument when you compare it to great violin players, great pianists. Pardon me. The organ was an instrument where the composers and the performers were very often the same people. And so, for instance, you had César Franck, a 19th century French composer, played the organ and composed for organ, in addition, obviously, to composing for many other instruments. Berlioz incorporated organ into his works. You had the great Camille Saint-Saëns with his organ symphony, Symphony Number 3, potentially the greatest piece ever written around an organ. You had at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, one of the great titans of the organ, Widor, one of the absolute heroes to any organist, and his Symphony Number 5 remains one of the most popular pieces in the solo organ repertoire to this day. We've got our first comment. This first synthesizer and VST orchestral emulator. Yeah, I'm definitely going to get to some of the synthesizers that really owe their existence to the organ. Frankly, almost every keyboard instrument ever owes a lot to the organ. So definitely that's just another reason why the organ is the king of all instruments. And it wasn't just France in the 19th century. You had composers like Tchaikovsky in Russia incorporate the organ into the finale of his Manfred Symphony. Richard Strauss in the late 19th and early 20th century, lots of organ incorporated into his symphonic poems. One of my favorite composers ever, Bruckner, was an organist, and he composed his symphonies for a full modern orchestra as if they were an organ. And so while his organ pieces are not so well known, his symphonies owe so much to who he was, and that was an organist, a composer organist. And that you can really hear that in Bruckner, and more composers as we go into the early 20th century. Mahler, one of my Scriabin, one of my very favorite composers ever, incorporated the organ and even created something to be played with his Fifth Symphony, the Promethean Symphony, called a light organ, where a musician, a performer, would sit at a keyboard instrument that looked kind of like the console, meaning the keyboard of an organ. Well, the console is where everything is, and the keyboards themselves are called manuals. There's a whole language that surrounds the organ. But he arranged for a musical instrument to be played like a keyboard, only it would trigger lights shining in the concert hall, which would correspond to the various chords and tones that were in the actual composition. It was a wonderfully interesting idea. Some people, subsequent to Scriabin's death in 1915, have tried it. But again, the organ was getting very versatile by now, because now that we're in the 20th century, we have the appearance of the theater organ or cinema organ. Now, the sort of origin of this actually dates back to before the first modern cinemas, but not too much before. We're talking the tail end of the 19th century, and Robert Hope Jones is the man that was generally credited with inventing the theater organ. Now, what is a theater organ? Well, in practice, it's not all of, well, in theory, I should say, it's not all that different from a traditional pipe organ, only it literally has more bells and whistles. It's simply bigger, more manuals, more sound effects. You have a lot of percussion. You have a lot of wind instruments that you can play with the manuals, the keyboards on the organ. And this was meant to accompany silent films. And in practice, these organs were placed in many sort of different venues. Again, city halls and civic centers that before would have a traditional pipe organ. By this time in the early 20th century, many were putting these theater organs in. You have one of the biggest organs in the world at the Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. You have them at basketball arenas, like the old Chicago arena had a brilliant theater organ. You have them in baseball stadiums at this point. You have them everywhere. And when Talking Pictures, when Talking Movies came in at the end of the 20s, it did mark kind of the end of an era for these theater organs, but again, they continue to be used in other public and civic venues, including sporting arenas, because you could get this huge orchestral sound in terms of the dynamics and in terms of the diversity of the sounds the organist could produce, all for the price of one musician. So it just kind of made sense. And the instrument was itself something of an attraction. This is true of both traditional organs and theater organs, because they were big, they were grand, they were a star unto themselves. And they continued to be into the mid 20th century, although the arrival of high fidelity and stereophonic recordings in the 40s and 50s, it did somewhat put a damper on this, because if you have a big public venue, it's easier for a non-musician to play a recording on record or tape than it is to construct an organ and find a musician to hire. But what really got me thinking about organ, other than what we talked about in yesterday's live stream, about how the organ really was shaped by so many sociological trends, which then itself came to shape other artistic trends. The other thing that got me thinking of this, pardon me, was a phenomenon that a lot of people probably don't think about a lot. I'm just going to grab some water. And this is the phenomenon in generally in North America of the organ-based pizza parlor. And you heard that right. So, after the Second World War, in the 50s and 60s, we're into the age of high fidelity sound. The recording sounded pretty much as good as a live performance, with the stipulation that a recording is never going to sound as good as a good live performance. It might sound better than a bad one. And so the demand for these huge, larger than life organs tended to wane a bit, which meant that some venues that were removing them were selling them. And in the late 60s, pizza parlors in North America started to buy them and they started to install them. And this trend really reached its pinnacle in the 70s. You had a lot of these organ themed pizza parlors. One of the first ones was in California, Hayward, California, which I think is where Journey's Steve Perry is originally from. And this was called the Ye Old Pizza Joint. You had them all over the US. And there was even an organist that I only recently discovered had passed away in 2020, a wonderful musician called Tommy Stark. He actually was a house organist for one of these chains in Southern California called Organ Power Pizza. And these places were hugely popular. They incorporated the theater organ, usually on a pedestal at the front of the restaurant, and people would be sitting at tables, eating, drinking, dancing while the organist played. And people like Tommy Stark would take requests. And what was so interesting about the organ is that it's so versatile. There is not really any genre that an organ cannot play. It is such a versatile and diverse instrument. You can tell I really like it, but so do a lot of people, which is why this concept of the organ pizza parlor was so big in the 70s and into the 80s. And as I was sort of thinking about this and looking into it a bit more, I found that one of these places that began in the 1970s is actually still open. Most of them have sadly closed, but there's one in Mesa, Arizona that's still open, and I've got the name written down. It's called Organ Stop Pizza. And not only is it still going strong, but in the 90s, when organs weren't really the most popular instrument in any genre, they had so much demand from their customers that they had to move the organ piece by piece to a bigger location, still in Mesa, Arizona. And I'm just looking now at a picture of this place. It looks absolutely fantastic. So this is definitely one for the bucket list. But what this demonstrated is that even while the cinema adopted recorded sound so that you could hear dialogue, the organ didn't go away. These big, magnificent organs still had a home. And these pizza places in various parts of North America were absolutely legendary. Now, I want to say a few more words about Tommy Stark, the organist who I mentioned. He was an absolutely fantastic musician whose main instrument was the theater organ, but he also sold organs of all sorts. He played organs of all varieties, and I found a memorial page for him. And I just left a comment asking if anyone has some of the records he made and if they're willing to upload them to some place, YouTube or otherwise, where we could all listen to him, because he was such a talent and a really nice man as well. Got to see him live a few times. Well, quite a few times. Got to hear some recordings of his that are now long out of my possession, but hopefully someone will be able to upload those, because he was one of the modern masters whose one of his specialties, among many, was playing the pop tunes of the day, arranged by, from memory, all internal, for these wonderful theater organs. So you name whatever your favorite song was, he could organize it. Yeah, terrible pun, but he could. And he was brilliant. So rest in peace. I only found out this week that he had died in 2020. I wish I knew at the time, but obviously news about musicians who aren't, at the top of the charts doesn't always travel fast. And we'll get to some other organs that or other organists rather, that I love as well. But let's go back in time a bit to the 1930s and 40s, because it was around this time that another great revolution in organism, another rim shot there for you, took place. And this is the invention of the electromechanical organ. And these were initially designed to be a less physically cumbersome version of a pipe organ, whether a traditional pipe organ from a concert hall or church, or one of these ultra huge theater organs. And the most well known company to make these was, of course, Hammond. So much so that when someone says, "Oh, I play the Hammond," that has entered the lexicon, because the Hammond organ, as a unique instrument, really became something that dotted the musical landscape in a huge way. But it was initially thought that it could be used in civic centers, in churches, in the kinds of places, theaters, that you would see the organ. But it really took off in the jazz world in the 1950s. People like Jimmy Smith, people like Brother Jack McGruff, later on, people like Larry Young, one of the most innovative organists of any genre, a true genius, Richard Groove Holmes. You had so many. And then it eventually became adopted by the rock world. It was already part of the pop world because of the symbiotic relationship pop and jazz had in the 40s and 50s. And rockers began to adopt it. And you had some pretty famous practitioners of it. John Lord of Deep Purple with his Hammond organ, Ken Hensley with Uriah Heep, Keith Emerson with the Nice, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer played many instruments, but one of the first he played and would continue to play was the Hammond organ and variations thereof. Same goes for Rick Wakeman, started on the piano, but a very good organist as well. And the list goes on. The organ was so common in all of the music of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And by the late 70s, you saw organ design being adopted into many synthesizers. The Yamaha GX1, one of the most expensive analog synths ever to be made at the end of the 70s, was kind of a hybrid between a synthesizer and what looked like a traditional organ with the three manuals that it had. Even in the early days of synthesizers, I would say that the inspiration from them actually came from the organ, because what was the role of the synthesizer? It was to use analog electronics to manipulate the naked sound wave into interesting sounds that could then become music or sound effects, but primarily music. And it was the organ, and in particular, these huge early 20th century theater organs, that served a similar purpose of producing a wide variety of sounds that could be relatively easily manipulated by a single musician. And so people like Robert Moog, the inventor of at least the modern synthesizer, and others, companies like ARP and later on Oberheim, the guys who made sequential, what was it called? Sequential circuits, who made the Prophet 5 at the end of the 70s. All of these synthesizer makers were really, Roland, all of them were influenced by the organ, both the electromechanical Hammond organ and things like the Vox Continental, things like the Farfisa, all of these. I mean, look at what the Doors did. I think Manzarek played a Vox Continental. If I'm not mistaken, someone can correct me. He also played the Hammond. What would the Doors be without organ? They were an organ-centric band. And I'm not talking about what Jim Morrison allegedly, but probably didn't do on stage at the Dinner Key Theater in Florida. Anyway, so the organ, although its shape can change, and no two pipe organs are alike, other kinds of organs and instruments inspired by the organ remained ubiquitous. And I would say that even once we get into the 80s, when synthesizers become increasingly polyphonic and sophisticated, and now you have samplers being built in to some of these synths, it all really owes itself to the organ. Even the Mellotron, a kind of proto synthesizer that used tape recordings of real instruments so that you could press down the keys and hear a violin section or a cello section or an organ or a trumpet or what have you. That too, there would be no Mellotron without the great theater organs. Now, just some other organ composers that I think you might be interested in. I mentioned Widor, one of the greatest of the 19th and 20th century, Marcel Dupri, another Frenchman, both a great composer and a great performer. In the world of Bach, you had Helmut Walcher, a great exponent of Bach who brought Bach back in the 20th century. Karl Richter, another great organist in the classical world. E. Power Biggs, another. Virgil Fox, one of my very favorites because he was so versatile. He could play classical, he could play pop. He traveled around with one of the biggest organs ever, a big console organ, but he could play, of course, every kind of organ. And so definitely listen to some Virgil Fox. And of course, a lesser known, but I think equally good performer in this genre, Tommy Stark, who sort of really helped to modernize the organ. Definitely try to find me some of those recordings because I'm desperate to find them. TC, another comment in the chats. The early Moog oscillators used organ-based footage to set the octave range. That they did. Again, Robert Moog. Don't know if he ever played the organ. That would be an interesting thing to try to check out, but definitely influenced by the organ and really in many ways complementary. When you look at people like Rick Wakeman, he would have a couple of mini Moogs. Eventually, he'd have about 4 of them more, sitting on top of a couple of Hammond organs, pianos, other synthesizers. So the idea that the keyboard can unleash as many sounds as can be limited by a sky-high imagination. Again, we owe so much of that to the organ and its evolution. Trying to think of some other great organists. I mentioned Larry Young. What an excellent player he is. Joey DeFrancesco, who was sort of a younger guy, sadly gone as well, but he's sort of very much in that spirit of Brother Jack McDuff and O'Donnell Levy, his organ-based groups, people like Jimmy Smith, did I say Brother Jack McDuff, Richard Groove Holmes? So many great ones in that era. And it was, again, so diverse. You could play it in the club. You could play it in the church. The joke with Hammond organs is there was the exact same instrument, a model B3 and C3. The only difference is the B3 was easier to move because it had 4 legs, where the C3 was a solid body. And the joke was that C for the church, B for the bar. It's an old joke among organ players. And bringing things into the 20th century, during the whole COVID horror show, I had the good fortune to discover through YouTube a great organist called Jonathan Scott. And the reason I discovered him at that time is that he would do these virtual concerts online. So it would be like a regular concert, usually 45 minutes to an hour in length, with him playing, and it was absolutely fantastic. And from there, I mean, he had a YouTube channel before, but that's where it really grew big. And he continues to upload, I think, usually once a week, sometimes more. Really wonderful stuff. Such a talented young man. And his brother is equally talented. His brother, Tom Scott, is a wonderful pianist and also a great photographer and animator. And together they have the Scott Brothers duo, where they play a lot of stuff together. And it was from them that I got reacquainted with an organ composer that I had almost forgotten from the late 19th, early 20th century. Again, the sort of golden age of the modern romantic organ. This was a guy called Pietro Yon, born in Italy, but really spent his professional career in the US. And their version for organ and piano of his Concerto Gregoriano is one of the most amazing things I've ever heard. So definitely check that out. What else and who else can we check out? There's really so many good ones. I've tried to name a lot of them. There's definitely, in terms of the clip that you should check out, it's on YouTube. For some reason, it's not on the streaming services, but this is of Widor playing his most famous piece, the Fifth Symphony himself. And it's always so interesting to hear a composer perform his own music. So definitely check out the clip of Widor playing his own his own great Fifth Symphony. He wrote so many of these organ symphonies. Jan was also quite prolific, and some of Jan's stuff is on Spotify. I will say that for whatever reason, Jonathan and Tom Scott don't have their music on the streaming services. If you're listening, guys, you really should. But they have a prolific YouTube channel, the Scott Brothers. So definitely check them out. Dick Liebert was another really good theater organist in the mid 20th century, did some hi fi recordings for Westminster, a great record label in the 50s and 60s, and also for the great RCA Living Stereo. Virgil Fox did a lot for RCA Living Stereo as well. So definitely check that out. So, again, for those who may have tuned in late, Tommy Stark, a great organist. He played, most well known for playing in California and Hawaii. He had residences in various performance venues in both of those places. If you have any of his recordings that are quite hard to find now, please do let me know. And I guess so. You might be asking, well, what was the point of this video? Well, it was to declare my love of the organ, the instrument, you weirdos, but also to try to introduce people to some great organists and great organ pieces. I don't know if I mentioned Poulenc, who wrote a wonderful organ symphony in the early 20th century. Charles Munck, a great conductor, did a great version of that. He also did what is arguably the best recording of the Saint-Saëns organ concerto, so definitely check that out. Also try to check out a contemporary recording of Sir Henry Wood's arrangement of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. The most famous arrangement of that is generally Ravel's. My personal favorite overall is Stokowski's, but definitely check out my second favorite, really close to the first, Sir Henry Wood, because the finale of that, The Great Gate at Kiev, has organ in it, because as I said, as these huge organs are being installed into these grand concert halls in the 19th and 20th centuries, you really saw a lot of organ being incorporated into big choral and symphonic pieces in a much more direct way than just the continuo that might have been there in older liturgical choral pieces. So again, Richard Strauss, check out his festive prelude. Karl Böhm did a great recording of that for Deutsche Grammophon. Really great organ there. There's organ in other Strauss pieces, his Alpine Symphony, also Sprach Zarathustra, made famous in Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. And of course, Elvis, Andy Kaufman, and others. So that's my tribute to the organ. Definitely support Jonathan Scott and his brother Tom. They're doing fantastic things on YouTube. And again, Tommy Stark, if you've got any of his organ recordings, definitely drop me a comment or a message. Remember, this is still a young and growing channel, so like, subscribe, share it around, especially if you have any of these rare recordings I'm talking about, and we will see you next time. Take care, and thanks for listening.